Alright, let's talk about the epidermis layer. And it's made up of many layers, so you could see that number one, some of these layers are just one cell deep, some are a couple of cell deep, and then some, like this one could be up to anywhere from 11 to 30 layers deep, depending on what type of tissue this is. So let's kind of go over it, kind of get an idea of what it is before we kind of jump in. And this unit will be the 5 different components of epidermis. If we start out with superficial, which is the layer that you can touch, the outer layer, we have the Stratum Corneum. That's going to be the dead layer that you can touch, and it's got multiple layers. This is what sloughs off and becomes dust later. The Stratum lucidum, Stratum Granulosum. This one, under the microscope, if we were to look at a little picture of it, you'd see these little sort of grains or spots in them, and that's how it gets its name. Stratum Spinosum. This one starts to develop like star shapes as it gets closer to this top layer, and it's because the water is starting to shrink out of it, and the organelles are starting to come apart, so they are connecting to each other really well, and that's what's giving it its weird sort of spiny sort of shape. And then Stratum Basal, and this is going to be the bottom layer. And this is going to be the deepest layer, and this is going to do some special things that the top won't do, and we'll talk about that in a second. But let's talk about the cells that sort of support the epidermis layer. So keep in mind, we're just talking about the epidermis layer. Below that would be the dermis, and then finally the hypodermis. We're not covering those in this video. We're only doing the epidermis, the top layer. Those other two will be a separate video. So first thing, the cells of the epidermis, there's going to be keratinocytes, and that's just cells that will produce a protein called keratin. And keratin is going to be something that's going to make cells a little harder and eventually make them the tough material that they need to be. They arise from the stratum basal, and they continuously undergo mitosis. So this is going to be an area that has rapid mitosis in the body. The next one that we're going to talk about is melanocytes. Anytime you hear the word cytes, it's going to be an area that we produce something. So with keratinocytes, it's an area that we produce keratin. Melanocytes is an area that we're going to produce the pigment melanin. And we'll talk about melanin later, but we'll talk about how everybody on the planet roughly has the same number of melanocytes, but depending on your pigmentation, you might have more melanin or less melanin, and we'll kind of discuss why that happens. It's found in the stratum basal, that first layer. And melanin acts as like sunglasses or sunscreen, kind of bounces off sunlight. The darker your skin color, the more it can reflect. The lighter it is, the more sun it can absorb, and there's probably less sun around when you have lighter skin. Dendritic cells, these are going to be part of our immune system. Basically, they go around and they find cells that don't belong and kill them. They arise from our bone marrow, and then they just kind of go right to the skin layer and wait for anything that they can kind of kill. And then you'll hear them 2 different ways. Your book calls them Merkel cells, but some people call them tactile cells. They're sensory receptor for touch. So they have the ability to do light touch and dark touch, and we'll actually talk about them a little later. And when we talked about the layers of the skin, there was a mnemonic that I wanted you to kind of have, and it's "Come, let's get sunburn." And that kind of goes from the superficial layer all the way to the deepest. So, come, let's get sunburn. That's going to be the order of layers in just the epidermis. So let's start with the deep and move out. So the deep would be the stratum basal layer. This kind of reminds me of basement, so basal, first layer. And it's going to be the deepest layer to the epidermis. It's a single layer. It sits on the basement membrane, so it helps with a little bit of connection. This is going to be an area of rapid mitosis, and also it's going to push cells towards the surface. So it's going to push cells out. This is where we're going to produce these melanocytes. So melanocytes are going to sit in here. It's a type of cell that produces melanin, and that's going to be responsible for skin color. And we'll talk about that later this chapter. Our next layer is going to be our Stratum Spinosum. And it's called this because the cells are actually starting to lose some of the water, and they're still connected to each other. So they kind of look spiny if we were to stain it and look at it under a microscope, and that's how it got its odd name. It's several layers thick. The cell types are going to be designed for dendritic cells, or most abundant here. So this is where we're going to have our line of defense for immunity. We don't want it to get past this Stratum Spinosum. Melanin granules are produced here, so this is where skin color actually sets up. Keratinocytes, they're going to be involved in this layer, and they're going to be designed for cell hardening. Our next layer is going to be the Stratum Granulosum. And that means what happens in this layer is it looks like there's these little granules or pellets inside that layer. And why this is happening is because the internal body parts of the cell are starting to go away, and they're starting to sort of shrivel up. The other thing that we're seeing in this layer is that the cells are starting to flatten. They're doing this thing called exocytosis, which is they're pushing things out of themselves. And what they're actually pushing out is fat. And that fat layer, that little thin lipid, the glycolipid that they're doing, is really why we're waterproof. So it's pushing off a little bit of fat. It's also starting to shrivel up its organelles, its nuclei are gone, and now it's just starting to become a barrier. And it's usually 3 to 6 layers long, deep. It cuts the surface layer for nutrients, so now here we're not going to get as many nutrients. This is where cells are definitely going to be dead. Usually the stratum basal layer is going to be able to do osmosis and diffusion up, but this is where that kind of stops. So these cells aren't going to be getting nutrients and things like they should if they were closer to the bottom. Keratinization also begins. So this is where cells are going to start to get a little harder, and the cell is definitely starting to die here. Stratum lucidum is only in a few cells. So these cells definitely have no organelles. They definitely have no nuclei because they've been lost in the granulosum stratum. And what happens here is this is only going to be in really thick skin. So this is going to be like at the bottom of your feet and the palms of your hands. So this isn't everywhere. This is kind of like an optional layer. And it's only in a few places. It's going to be also an area that doesn't produce sebum, which is that oily substance, which totally makes sense. Can you imagine if the palms of your hands or the bottom of your feet were oily all the time? You would slip and fall, and these are areas that also don't sweat. Stratum Corneum. This is going to be the upper layer. Some people call it the horny layer because it is the layer that's sort of the hardest. It could be anywhere from 11 to 30 layers of just dead skin. It's definitely keratinized, which is hard. The surface cells flake off constantly, and that's what most household dust is. And that's kind of that layer that dust mites sort of hang out, or the skin mites that you sort of hang out. They just hang out in that first couple layers, and they're sort of just eating the dead cells and kind of killing them off. So the difference between thin and thick cells are thin cells. This is going to be the most abundant. So thin skin, they're going to be the most abundant. They're found throughout the body. They don't have that stratum lucidum layer. Remember I said those are only going to be in areas of thick skin, so the palm of your hands, feet. And then the stratum corneum layer is thinner. Thicker skin basically is going to be found in those few areas I told you about. They include that stratum lucidum, so this one has it, this one doesn't. It has a thicker layer of that stratum corneum, that outer layer, and that's what makes it thick. These two items sort of make it much, much thicker. They lack hair follicles, they lack oil glands, which totally makes sense. Our next video will cover the dermis layer.